Tom Andrews pulled his coat tighter as he stepped out of his car, the late November air biting sharper than he expected. Thanksgiving had always felt different since Cat passed quieter, heavier, but he still held on to the hope that family could soften the edges. Becky's house glowed with warm yellow light, windows fogged from cooking, laughter leaking faintly through the walls. For a moment, Tom allowed himself to believe this would be a normal holiday. One meal, one evening where things felt right again, then he saw Connor. The boy stood near the side of the house, shoulders hunched, hands shoved deep into the pockets of a thin hoodie that had no business being worn in this cold. His breath puffed white in short bursts, eyes fixed on the ground like he was trying to disappear into it. Tom froze mid-step, his chest tightening in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. It took him a second to process what he was seeing: his grandson, alone outside, while the house behind him buzzed with warmth and life. Tom glanced toward the front door, expecting it to swing open, expecting someone to call Connor inside. No one did. He walked closer, boots crunching softly on the frost-stiff grass. "Connor," he said gently. The boy looked up, startled, relief flashing across his face before he tried and failed to hide it. His cheeks were red from the cold, his hands trembling just enough for Tom to notice. Too much for Tom not to notice. Before saying another word, Tom shrugged off his coat and draped it around Connor's shoulders. The fabric swallowed him, and Connor instinctively pulled it closed, clinging to it like a lifeline. Tom felt something sharp twist in his chest. He had seen men abandoned on docks halfway across the world, left to fend for themselves in worse conditions, but never had it hurt like this. "Come on," Tom said quietly. "You shouldn't be out here." Inside, the smell of roasted turkey and buttered vegetables hit him immediately, rich and almost overwhelming. Becky stood at the head of the dining table, smiling brightly as she carved the bird. David and Laura Hayes sat comfortably, wine glasses already half empty, their coats neatly hung, their laughter effortless. They barely glanced up when Tom and Connor entered. Connor hesitated just inside the doorway, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to be there. Tom placed a steady hand on his shoulder and guided him forward. Becky noticed then just a flicker of irritation crossing her face before she smoothed it away. "He's been outside," Tom said, keeping his voice level. "It's freezing." Becky sighed, the sound sharp and impatient. "Dad, he's fine. He was being difficult. I needed him out of the way while I finished dinner." Out of the way. The words landed heavier than Becky seemed to realize. Tom looked at her, really looked at her, and saw none of the warmth he remembered from years ago. No concern, no hesitation, just annoyance, as if Connor were an inconvenience instead of her son. "He's 15, Tom said. "Not a coat rack." David cleared his throat awkwardly, Laura suddenly very interested in adjusting her napkin. Becky shot Tom a warning look. "Can we not do this right now? It's Thanksgiving." Tom glanced down at Connor, who stood silent beside him, eyes lowered, used to this, used to being overlooked. Something inside Tom shifted then, a slow, unmistakable click, like a door finally locking into place. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a bad moment. This was a pattern, and he had been blind to it for far too long. He helped Connor into a chair, pulling it out himself, when no one else moved. Becky returned to carving the turkey, conversation resuming in forced fragments, the room thick with something unspoken. Tom didn't sit. He stayed standing, hands resting on the back of Connor's chair, grounding himself. Kat's voice echoed in his memory, soft, steady, unwavering. Family doesn't leave its own out in the cold. Tom looked around the table, at the polished smiles, the untouched discomfort, the son who had been left to shiver so others could be entertained. His jaw tightened, resolve settling deep in his bones. He said nothing more, but inside, the decision was already made. This Thanksgiving would not end the way Becky expected. Not this time. Tom stood just inside the sliding glass door, the cold seeping in through the thin seam where it didn't quite close right. From where he was, he could see both worlds at once. Inside, Becky laughed too loudly at something David had said, her hand resting lightly on Laura's arm as if they were old friends instead of carefully cultivated company. Wine glasses clinked. The table was full, warm, alive. Outside, reflected faintly in the dark glass, Connor's small figure sat hunched near the porch railing, barely moving. The contrast hit Tom like a quiet punch to the chest. No one at the table looked toward the window. Not once. Tom watched for longer than he should have, waiting for anyone to notice what was missing. His grandson, the empty chair, the absence that should have been impossible to ignore. Becky leaned forward to serve more turkey, smiling, playing the part perfectly. If Tom hadn't known better, he might have believed this was exactly how she wanted the evening to go. He stepped fully inside and slid the door shut behind him. The warmth rushed back over his skin, but it didn't reach his chest. Becky's eyes flicked to him for half a second, then dropped back to the table like she hadn't seen him at all. The tension was subtle, but Tom felt it immediately, tight and humming beneath the surface. "Becky," he said, not raising his voice, just enough to cut through the chatter. She paused, knife hovering over the platter. "What?" she asked, still not looking at him. "Connor's still outside." That finally got her attention. She turned, irritation flashing across her face before she masked it, with a thin smile meant more for her in-laws than for him. "Dad, I told you he's fine. He wanted some air. Teenagers do that." Tom stared at her, searching for something familiar. Guilt, doubt, anything. He found none. "It's 30 degrees, he said quietly. "That's not air. That's cold." David shifted in his seat. Laura cleared her throat. Becky exhaled sharply. "You're making this into something it's not." Tom nodded once, slowly, as if he were accepting her words. But inside, something was unraveling. He had spent decades learning when to speak and when to stay quiet, when to follow orders and when to challenge them. This wasn't one of those moments that could be ignored. His phone vibrated in his pocket. A low, familiar buzz. Tom stepped away from the table and answered it without looking at the screen. "Jim?" he said. "Happy Thanksgiving, old man." Jim Robinson's voice came through, steady and warm. "Just checking in. You still breathing?" Tom let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Barely." He moved toward the hallway, lowering his voice. "Connor's outside," he said. "In the cold. Becky's got her in-laws at the table like it's nothing." There was a pause on the other end. Then Jim said, "How long?" "Too long." Jim didn't hesitate. "Then it's already crossed a line." Tom closed his eyes. He could picture Jim clearly leaning back, jaw set, the same look he'd worn in situations where excuses got people hurt. "Don't let this slide, Tom," Jim continued. "You do, and it becomes normal. For her, for the kid." Tom swallowed hard. "She says he's being difficult." "Kids don't get difficult for no reason," Jim said. "And good parents don't leave them out in the cold. You know that." The words settled deep. Tom thought of Kat then, her quiet strength, the way she had drawn lines without raising her voice. Kat wouldn't have argued. She wouldn't have justified. She would have acted immediately, decisively, because family was never negotiable to her. "I know," Tom said softly. He ended the call and stood there for a moment longer, staring at the hallway wall like it might offer him another option. It didn't. The frustration that had been simmering since he arrived finally boiled over into something sharper, clearer. Resolve. Tom turned back toward the dining room. Becky was laughing again, the moment already forgotten by everyone but him. He looked past her, toward the door, toward the boy who had learned far too young how to endure silence. No more. Tom straightened his shoulders and took a step forward, the decision fully formed now. He wasn't going to watch anymore. He wasn't going to wait. Whatever came next would be uncomfortable, messy, and impossible to undo. But for Connor's sake, he was done being a silent witness. Tom sat at the edge of the dining table, his chair pulled slightly back, as if his body already knew it didn't belong fully in the room. The clink of silverware and the low hum of conversation filled the space, but it all felt muted to him, like he was hearing it through water. Across from him, Becky leaned toward David and Laura, laughing at something trivial, her voice lighter than he remembered it ever being. She gestured with her wineglass, nodding eagerly, absorbing their approval like it was oxygen. Connor sat 2 seats away, quiet, shoulders drawn inward. He picked at his food without looking up, moving carefully, like he didn't want to draw attention to himself. No one asked him a question. No one noticed how little he ate. Tom watched it all unfold, every small omission stacking on top of the last, until the weight of it pressed against his ribs. Becky didn't once look in his direction. Tom folded his hands together, knuckles stiff, and tried to steady his breathing. He told himself to stay calm, to observe. That's what the Navy had taught him, read the room before you act. But this wasn't a foreign port. or a hostile negotiation. This was his family, and somehow that made it worse. As Becky launched into a story about her work, exaggerating just enough to impress, Tom's mind drifted back years, to quieter nights when Kat would sit at the kitchen table, sorting bills or folding laundry, always keeping one ear open for Becky's voice down the hall. Kat believed in presence, in noticing. People remember who made them feel like they mattered, she used to say, especially kids. Tom looked at Connor again and felt that old ache of grief tighten in his chest. Kat would have shut this down the second she saw it. No hesitation, no excuses. She would have pulled a chair out herself if she had to, placed a hand on Connor's back, made sure he was seen. The fact that she wasn't here, that Tom was the only one feeling this, made the room feel colder than the porch ever had. "Becky," Tom said, breaking into the conversation. She paused, mid-sentence, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "What, Dad?" He kept his voice even. "Connor hasn't said a word all night." She shrugged, already turning back toward her in-laws. "He's a teenager. You know how they are. Moody, quiet." "That's not what this is," Tom said. Becky's smile tightened. "Can we not psychoanalyze my kid at the table?" David shifted uncomfortably. Laura glanced between them, sensing the change in tone. The air around the table grew heavier, conversation stalling before limping back to life. But something had shifted. Tom could feel it. The easy warmth from earlier was gone, replaced by an edge that made every sound sharper. Tom leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on Becky. For the first time, it hit him fully. This wasn't just neglect. This was choice. Becky was choosing where to put her attention, her loyalty, her effort. And it wasn't here. It wasn't with her son. It wasn't with him. The realization hurt more than he expected. His phone vibrated again, subtle against his leg. Tom didn't need to check the screen to know who it was. He excused himself quietly and stepped into the hallway, answering the call before the second ring finished. "You all right?" Jim asked. Tom let out a short breath. "I don't think so." Jim listened as Tom spoke about the table, the way Connor seemed to shrink, the way Becky brushed everything aside. He didn't interrupt. When Tom finished, there was a moment of silence. "She's not going to change unless something forces her to," Jim said finally. "And it sounds like that something has to be you." Tom closed his eyes. "I don't want to blow this up." "Sometimes," Jim replied, "things are already broken. You just stop pretending they're not." Tom thought of Kat again, of the lines she never let anyone cross, of the way she protected what mattered without apology. He opened his eyes, his reflection staring back at him from the hallway mirror, older, tired, but still standing. When he returned to the table, Becky barely acknowledged him. Connor glanced up briefly, hope flickering before settling back into caution. Tom took his seat, but something inside him had shifted permanently. This wasn't about keeping the peace anymore. This was the moment. And Tom knew, with absolute clarity, that if he didn't act now, if he didn't take control, he never would. Tom pushed back from the table and moved toward the front door without asking permission. No one stopped him. The laughter behind him resumed almost immediately, softer now, as if lowered out of courtesy, not concern. When he stepped outside, the cold hit him fast and honest, clearing his head in a way the warm house never could. Connor sat on the porch steps, elbows on his knees, staring at a crack in the concrete like it held answers. His shoulders were tense, jaw clenched tight, the way Tom used to see in sailors who didn't want anyone to know they were struggling. The porch light cast a hard yellow glow over him, making him look smaller than he was. "Connor," Tom said gently. The boy flinched, then looked up. His eyes were glassy, but he blinked fast, forcing whatever was there back down. "Hey, Grandpa!" Tom lowered himself onto the step beside him, joints protesting quietly. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just sat there, letting the silence do the work. "Why are you out here?" he asked finally. Connor hesitated. He picked at a loose thread on his sleeve, avoiding Tom's eyes. "Mom said. She said I should wait outside for a bit, that I was being annoying." The words landed slow and heavy. Tom felt them settle deep in his chest, each one adding weight. "How long?" he asked. "I don't know," Connor said with a small shrug. "Until dinner was ready, I guess." Tom stood up before his anger could leak into his voice. He held out a hand. "Come on." Connor looked up, uncertain. "It's okay," he said quickly, like he was trying to make it easier for Tom. I'm used to it." That sentence did more damage than any raised voice could have. Tom didn't respond. He just waited, hands still out. After a beat, Connor took it. Inside, the warmth rushed over them again, thick with food and conversation. Tom guided Connor straight to the table, pulled out a chair himself, and waited until the boy sat. Plates shifted to make room. No one offered to help. Becky didn't even turn around. Connor stared at his plate, shoulders stiff, like he expected someone to tell him to move again. Tom leaned closer. "Eat," he said quietly. "You belong here." He straightened and looked at Becky. She was refilling Laura's wine glass, smiling, nodding along to something David was saying. Tom waited. When she finally noticed him standing there, her expression flickered with irritation. "Can I talk to you?" Tom asked. Becky sighed and set the bottle down harder than necessary. "Fine." They stepped into the kitchen, just far enough that the table noise blurred into background sound. Becky crossed her arms immediately, defensive before he even spoke. "You left him outside," Tom said. Becky rolled her eyes. "Dad, we've been over this. He was being difficult. I had guests." "He's not a coat," Tom replied. "You don't hang him outside until you're ready to deal with him." Her mouth tightened. "You're overreacting. He needed to cool off." "He needed his mother," Tom said, his voice low but steady. "Instead, you gave him the porch." Becky scoffed. "You have no idea what it's like raising a teenager." Tom held her gaze, unmoving. "I know what it's like to be ignored." That stopped her just for a second. Then she waved it off. "This is one night. You're acting like I abuse him." Tom shook his head slowly. "That's the problem. You think this is just tonight." He thought back, missed school events, Connor eating alone at family gatherings, the way the boy never complained but always seemed braced for disappointment. Patterns he'd ignored because it was easier, because Becky was his daughter. "No," Tom continued. "This has been happening for years, I just didn't want to see it." Becky's voice hardened. "So, now you're judging me? In my own house?" "I'm done letting you rewrite reality," Tom said, "and I'm done letting you use me as cover." She opened her mouth to argue, but he was already stepping back, already finished. The decision had settled into him, solid and immovable. Whatever came next, anger, fallout, consequences, he would face it. Tom turned toward the dining room, toward Connor sitting quietly where he should have been all along. Becky stared after him, something like uncertainty flickering across her face. But Tom didn't look back. He knew now that this wasn't a conversation he could undo, and he wasn't finished yet. The scrape of Tom's chair against the hardwood cut clean through the low murmur of conversation. Forks paused mid-air. Becky looked up, irritation already forming, as if she expected another mild comment she could brush aside. Tom didn't look at her right away. He stood, slowly, deliberately, his hands resting on the back of the chair Connor sat in, grounding himself. "This will be the last Thanksgiving we spend like this," Tom said. The room went still. Becky laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "Dad, what are you talking about?" Tom finally lifted his gaze, sweeping it across the table, David's stiff posture, Laura's tight smile, the half-finished plates, the boy beside him who hadn't said a word but had felt everything. "Unless something changes," Tom continued, his voice even, "this ends tonight." Becky pushed her chair back. "You don't get to come into my house and make ultimatums." "I do," Tom replied calmly. "When a child is left outside in the cold so adults can be entertained." "That's not what happened," Becky snapped. "You're twisting this." Tom didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You asked your son to wait outside so he wouldn't inconvenience you. Call it whatever you want." David shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat as if he might intervene. But one look at Tom's face made him stop. Laura stared down at her plate, suddenly fascinated by the pattern in the china. They had come for a polite holiday meal, not a reckoning. Becky crossed her arms, defensive. "You're blowing this out of proportion." "No," Tom said. "I've been shrinking it for years." He took a breath, steadying himself. "As of tonight, I'm cutting off all financial support." The words landed heavy. Becky stared at him, stunned. "You can't be serious." "I am," Tom said. "No more help. No more safety net. Not unless you take responsibility for what you've been doing." David's eyebrows shot up. Laura's lips parted slightly, then closed again. The silence around the table thickened, uncomfortable and inescapable. You're punishing me? Becky said, her voice rising. Over one argument? This isn't punishment, Tom replied. It's consequence. Becky shook her head, disbelief giving way to anger. You owe me that money. I'm your daughter. Tom felt the familiar tug of guilt try to surface, the instinct to soften, to repair. He pushed it aside. I owe Connor safety, he said, and I failed him by letting this go on. Connor looked up then, eyes wide, caught off guard by hearing his name spoken with certainty instead of dismissal. Tom straightened, shoulders squared. Which brings me to the inheritance. Becky froze. What about it? Tom didn't hesitate. It's no longer going to you. The words hit harder than anything else he'd said. Becky's face drained of color. That's not your decision to make on a whim. It is, Tom said quietly. And it wasn't a whim. He turned slightly, resting a hand on Connor's shoulder. The boy stiffened at the contact, then relaxed when Tom didn't pull away. I've already made arrangements. Everything goes to Connor. The room erupted at once. You did what? Becky shouted. David stood halfway out of his chair. Tom, let's slow down. Tom raised a hand, not aggressively, just enough to stop them. I've spoken to my lawyer. The paperwork is done, trusts, protections, all of it. Connor's future is secure. Laura's eyes flicked to Becky, then back to Tom, the calculation unmistakable. Becky stared at him like she was seeing a stranger. You went behind my back. I went ahead of you, Tom corrected, because you've proven I can't trust you to put your son first. Becky's voice shook now, anger cracking into something closer to panic. You're doing this to control me. Tom shook his head slowly. No, I'm doing this because I let you control me for too long. He looked around the table one last time. Family isn't about appearances. It's about who you protect when no one's watching. Connor's fingers tightened around his fork. He didn't speak, but his breathing changed deeper, steadier, like something inside him had finally shifted. Becky sank back into her chair, stunned, her arguments evaporating under the weight of what she'd just lost. For the first time that night, she looked small. Tom remained standing, the room heavy with unfinished food and unspoken fallout. He knew this moment couldn't be taken back. He also knew it was only the beginning. Because once the money was gone, the real consequences would finally begin. Becky's chair slammed back as she stood, the sound sharp enough to make Connor flinch. You've completely lost your mind, she said, her voice rising. All of this over one stupid moment. You're blowing it up because you want control. Tom didn't move. He remained standing at the head of the table, hands resting lightly on the wood, his posture steady in a way that only made her angrier. I'm not overreacting, he said calmly. I'm reacting to years of excuses. You don't get to rewrite my life, Becky shot back. You weren't here. You don't know how hard this has been. I know exactly how hard it's been, Tom replied. I just didn't want to admit why. David finally spoke, his tone careful, diplomatic. Tom, let's all take a breath. This is a family matter. Maybe it doesn't need to go this far. Laura nodded quickly. Emotions are high. Maybe everyone says things they don't mean on holidays. Tom turned to them then, his gaze firm but not hostile. This has nothing to do with the holiday, he said, and it's gone this far because it was allowed to. Becky let out a harsh laugh. So that's it? You cut me off? Humiliate me in front of my own family? And walk away feeling righteous? Tom met her eyes. I walk away knowing I won't tolerate this anymore. The words settled like stone. Becky opened her mouth to argue again, but this time nothing came out. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw that this wasn't a bluff. The anger on her face didn't disappear, but beneath it, something else flickered. Fear. Connor sat quietly between them, hands folded in his lap. He didn't speak, didn't interrupt, but his shoulders had relaxed. He ate a few bites of turkey, slow and tentative, like he was testing whether this inclusion was real. When Tom glanced at him, Connor met his eyes and gave the smallest nod. Gratitude, unspoken but unmistakable. Tom felt it then, a tightness in his chest, easing just enough to let him breathe. Becky noticed the exchange, her jaw clenched. You've turned him against me, she said bitterly. No, Tom replied. I stood with him. David shifted again, clearly uncomfortable. We should probably go, he said to Laura, already pushing his chair back. This isn't our place. Laura murmured agreement, eyes avoiding Becky's. The carefully curated image of a perfect family dinner had collapsed completely, leaving only the raw edges behind. Coats were gathered. Polite goodbyes fell flat. The front door closed with a final, hollow thud. When the house was quieter, Becky rounded on Tom once more. "You think this is strength?" she demanded. "Destroying your own daughter?" Tom shook his head. "I think letting a child believe he deserves to be left out in the cold is destruction." Becky stared at him, breathing hard. For a moment, it looked like she might say something else, something honest. Instead, she turned away, retreating into silence. Tom's phone buzzed in his pocket. He stepped into the hallway and answered it without hesitation. "Jim, I heard enough in your voice earlier to know how this would go," Jim said. "You all right?" Tom leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. "It was worse than I expected." And Tom thought of Connor at the table, of Becky's shock, of the line he had finally drawn. It was necessary. Jim exhaled slowly. "You did the right thing. Standing up for a kid who can't stand up for himself that matters, even when it costs you." Tom felt the weight of the night settle over him, the damage done, the bridges burned, the conversations that would never be the same. But beneath it all, there was something unfamiliar. "Calm. I know," Tom said. "I just wish it hadn't taken me this long." "It took you exactly as long as it took," Jim replied. "What matters is you didn't walk away this time." Tom ended the call and stood there for a moment, listening to the house. Becky moving around in the kitchen. Connor quietly eating at the table. Two worlds still colliding, but no longer on Becky's terms. The fallout was far from over. Tom knew that. What he'd done tonight would ripple outward through lawyers, through family, through wounds that hadn't even surfaced yet. But as he looked back toward the dining room, toward his grandson sitting where he belonged, Tom felt something settle deep in his bones. For the first time in years, he wasn't reacting anymore. He was in control. Tom stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind him, the sound dull and final. The cold wrapped around him instantly, sharper now, or maybe he was just more aware of it. He stood on the edge of the porch, hands resting on the railing, breathing in air that felt clean compared to the heaviness inside the house. His heart was still pounding, not from anger anymore, but from the weight of what he'd just done. Lines had been crossed. Lines he couldn't uncross. Behind the door, Becky's voice carried through the walls, rising and falling in sharp bursts. He didn't need to hear the words to know the tone: indignation, disbelief, blame. It used to pull him back inside, used to make him doubt himself. Tonight, it didn't. His phone buzzed again. "Jim," Tom said, answering without looking. "I figured you'd step outside," Jim replied. "You always did that when things got loud." Tom gave a faint, humorless smile. "Some habits stick." Jim's voice softened. "You holding up?" Tom looked out at the quiet street, the neighbors' houses dark, peaceful, untouched by the storm unfolding behind him. "I think so," he said. "I just ended my relationship with my daughter." There was a pause. "You didn't end it," Jim said carefully. "You drew a line. What she does with that's on her." Tom nodded, even though Jim couldn't see him. He thought of Kat then, the way she used to stand firm without ever raising her voice. Loyalty wasn't loud to her. Integrity didn't need witnesses. Kat would have handled this the same way, Tom said. Maybe sooner. She trusted her instincts, Jim replied. "You're finally trusting yours." The door behind Tom rattled as Becky yanked it open, her voice spilling out into the cold. "So now you're just walking away?" she demanded. "You don't get to say all that and disappear." Tom ended the call and turned slowly. Becky stood in the doorway, arms crossed, anger burning hot and unfocused. "I'm not disappearing," he said evenly. "I'm deciding." "Deciding what?" she shot back. "That I won't be spoken to like this," Tom replied. "And I won't watch Connor be treated like an afterthought." Becky scoffed. "You're acting like some kind of martyr." Tom didn't rise to it. "I'm acting like a father," he said. "And a grandfather." They stood there for a moment, the cold air stretching the silence between them. Tom could see it then how badly Becky wanted him to back down, to soften, to retreat into the role he'd played for years. He didn't. "I'm going back inside," Tom said, "to finish this the right way." When he returned to the dining room, Becky followed, still muttering under her breath. Connor looked up as Tom entered, uncertainty flickering across his face. Tom took his seat, calm settling over him like armor. "This is where I stand," Tom said, his voice steady enough to quiet the room. "I won't tolerate disrespect. Not toward me. Not toward Connor." Becky opened her mouth, but Tom raised a hand, not to silence her, but to stop the cycle. "Unless you're willing to change," he continued, "this is the last time we sit at a table as a family." The words hung there, heavy and unmistakable. Becky stared at him, stunned. "You don't mean that?" "I do," Tom said. "Family isn't blood alone. It's how you treat the people who depend on you." He stood, not in anger, but with purpose. Connor watched him closely, something like understanding settling into his expression. Tom walked toward the door, coat in hand. He paused just long enough to look back at the table at what had been broken, and what had finally been protected. Then he left, the night closing around him as he stepped off the porch. He didn't know what Becky would do next, but for the first time, he knew exactly what he would not do anymore. Tom paused at the front door, his hand resting on the cold metal handle. Behind him, the house was no longer loud, just tense, like everyone inside was holding their breath, waiting for him to crack. He didn't turn around at first. He already knew what was coming. "Dad, wait." Becky's voice was different now. Softer, measured. The anger had drained out of it, replaced by something more dangerous: fear. Tom turned slowly. She stood a few feet away, hands clenched together, eyes searching his face like she might still find the father who always stepped in to fix things. "You don't have to do this," she said. "We can talk. I can make this right." Tom studied her for a long moment. He saw the daughter he'd raised, but he also saw the choices she'd made. "Talking isn't the problem," he said. "It's what you do after the talking that matters." David cleared his throat and stepped forward, his tone edged with frustration. "Tom, this has gone far enough. You're tearing this family apart over a misunderstanding." Laura nodded quickly. "Everyone's emotions are running high. Let's all calm down and revisit this later." Tom didn't look at them. "This isn't your conversation," he said evenly. David bristled. "We're part of this family now." Tom finally met his eyes. "You're guests," he replied, "and you've had more influence here than you ever should have." The room fell quiet again. Tom turned back to Becky. "You chose them," he said, "over your son, over your own family, and choices have consequences." Becky shook her head, desperation creeping in. "That's not fair. I was just trying to keep the peace. You know how they are." "I do," Tom said. "That's why I'm stepping away." Her composure cracked. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "I'll do better, I swear. Don't take everything from me." Tom felt the pull of it, the instinct to comfort, to forgive too quickly. It had ruled him for years. He pushed it aside. "I'm not taking anything," he said. "I'm just not protecting you from the results of your actions anymore." Becky reached for him, stopping herself at the last second. "You're really going to walk away?" "Yes," Tom said, "because this is the only way forward." Connor stood quietly near the table, watching it all unfold. When Tom looked at him, the boy stepped closer. "Grandpa," Connor said, his voice barely above a whisper, "thank you for standing up for me." The words hit Tom harder than anything else that night. He nodded, emotion tightening his throat. "Always," he said. He picked up his coat and opened the door. Cold air rushed in, clean and sharp. Tom stepped out onto the porch without looking back. As the door closed behind him, he felt it a calm he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't the end of the story, but it was the end of the line. The phone rang again while Tom was standing at the kitchen sink, watching snow gather along the edge of the window. He didn't need to check the screen. He already knew. Becky. Same name, same vibration, same weight pressing against his chest every time it happened. He let it ring. When it stopped, the silence felt loud, almost accusing. Tom exhaled slowly and turned back to the sink, focusing on the ordinary rhythm of rinsing dishes, stacking them to dry. Ordinary things helped. They reminded him that the world hadn't ended just because he'd finally stopped answering. The calls didn't stop after that night. They multiplied. Voicemails at first, angry, clipped messages accusing him of betrayal. Then longer ones, voice cracking, rewriting the story, painting herself as the victim. Tom listened to the first few. Each one pulled at something old and tender inside him. By the fourth day, he stopped opening them altogether. Connor noticed. They spent more time together now, not in grand gestures, but in quiet routines. Morning walks before school, Evenings where Tom cooked and Connor did homework at the kitchen table, occasionally asking questions Tom had to think about before answering. They started small traditions without naming them: Friday night soup and old movies, Sunday breakfasts that ran late and didn't feel rushed. Connor laughed more. Not loudly, just easily. Tom caught it one evening when Connor corrected him about a movie plot, smiling without checking to see if it was allowed. That smile stayed with Tom long after Connor went to bed. It felt like proof that something had been broken and was now healing. Becky's calls changed tone again. Now, they came late at night, longer, slower, messages filled with regret and apology, layered with guilt. I made mistakes, but I'm still your daughter. You can't just erase me. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she was calm in a way that felt practiced. Tom heard the manipulation beneath it, even when the words sounded right. He didn't call back. That part surprised him, the clarity. Letting go hurt more than the confrontation ever had. There were moments, quiet ones, when grief hit him sideways, when he saw something that reminded him of Becky as a child, when he wondered if Kat would have found a softer way. Those moments passed. Tom realized this was the hardest part, not standing up, not drawing the line, but holding it. Accepting that love didn't always mean access, that protecting Connor meant disappointing Becky, that being a father sometimes meant refusing to rescue your own child from the consequences of her choices. Connor, free from the tension he'd lived under for years, began to change in ways Tom hadn't expected. His teachers called to say he was more engaged. He slept better. He talked about the future without sounding like it was something happening to someone else. The boy who once shrank into corners now took up space, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. Becky noticed too. Her messages shifted again, sharper now. Accusations slipped back in. Claims that Tom was poisoning Connor against her, that he was stealing her son. Tom listened to one message all the way through, then deleted it. He didn't respond. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He stayed resolute. One evening, as Tom and Connor sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the houses across the street, Connor spoke without looking at him. "She's still calling you, isn't she?" Tom considered lying. He didn't. "Yes." Connor nodded. "You don't have to answer." "I know," Tom said. Connor was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm glad you don't." Tom felt something settle deep in his chest. Not relief exactly, acceptance. Later that night, when the house was quiet again, Tom checked his phone one last time. 3 missed calls. No voicemail. He set it face down on the table and turned off the light. He knew Becky would keep trying. He knew the backlash wasn't finished, not really. But the worst part had already passed. The part where he doubted himself. As Tom stood in the doorway and looked down the hall toward Connor's room, hearing steady, peaceful breathing on the other side, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Freedom. And with it, the certainty that whatever came next, lawyers, arguments, fallout, he would face it on his own terms. Tom was halfway through his morning coffee when his phone rang, the screen flashing a number he recognized immediately. His lawyer. That alone tightened something in his chest. They hadn't planned to talk again so soon. "Tom," the lawyer said without preamble, his tone measured but strained, "I need to ask you a question, and I need you to answer honestly. Did you authorize Becky to move funds out of the family estate over the last several years?" Tom felt the mug pause inches from his lips. "No," he said slowly. "Why would I?" There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Then, "Because she did." The words landed hard. Tom set the mug down. The ceramic clinked too loud in the quiet kitchen. "What do you mean she did?" "We've been reviewing the estate records," the lawyer continued. "Transfers. Accounts you didn't directly manage. At first glance, they looked routine maintenance costs, discretionary expenses. But when we traced them fully," he exhaled. "Tom, she's been siphoning money. For years." Tom closed his eyes. Images flooded back Becky's casual requests for help. Her confidence when she talked about finances, the way she always seemed unbothered by money despite spending freely. He had trusted her. Trusted that his daughter wouldn't see the family legacy as something to carve up quietly while no one was watching. "How much?" Tom asked. "Enough that it can't be dismissed as a misunderstanding," the lawyer said. This was intentional, structured, hidden. Something cold and steady replaced the last traces of doubt inside Tom. This wasn't just neglect. This wasn't just selfishness. This was deception. She was manipulating the accounts, Tom said quietly, more to himself than to the man on the phone. Yes, the lawyer replied, and if we don't act now, it puts Connor's future at risk. That name Connor snapped everything into focus. What do we do? Tom asked. We take legal action, the lawyer said. Formally, we reclaim the estate, lock down the assets, and document everything. But you should know this won't stay private. Tom looked toward the hallway, toward Connor's closed bedroom door. Good, he said. I'm done keeping secrets for her. Over the next few days, the truth unraveled faster than Tom expected. Financial records laid out in clean, unforgiving lines told a story Becky never meant to be read, end to end. Small withdrawals at first, then larger ones. Money rerouted through secondary accounts. Justifications typed neatly into memos, family expense, temporary loan, reimbursement. Lies disguised as responsibility. Tom felt anger. Yes, but more than that, he felt betrayed. Not just as a father, but as a man who had spent his life believing that integrity mattered even when no one was watching. Becky had counted on his silence, on his reluctance to look too closely, on his love blinding him. She had been wrong. When the legal filings were submitted, the response was immediate. Becky's lawyer pushed back hard, framing it as a misunderstanding, a family dispute blown out of proportion. Tom didn't respond publicly. He didn't need to. The document spoke for him. And then the story broke. A local outlet picked it up first. Retired Navy veteran sues daughter over misuse of family estate. Within days, larger publications followed. The narrative sharpened as details emerged. The money, the neglect, the grandson. Strangers weighed in with opinions Tom never asked for, but for the first time, he didn't feel exposed. He felt seen. Connor noticed the change before Tom said anything. People keep asking me questions at school, he said one evening. Not upset, just observant. Tom nodded. You don't owe anyone answers, he said. This is about keeping you safe. Connor considered that, then nodded back. Okay. As the case gained momentum, Tom felt something unfamiliar settle into place. Control. Not the kind that dominated or silenced, but the kind that came from clarity, from refusing to carry someone else's wrongdoing. For years, Becky had dictated the terms, managed the money, shaped the story. Now the truth was moving on its own, unstoppable. One night, after another call with his lawyer confirming that the estate was being fully secured under Connor's name, Tom sat alone at the kitchen table. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt steady. His dignity, something he hadn't realized he'd slowly given away, was his again. But as he stared at the stack of legal documents in front of him, Tom knew this fight wasn't finished. Exposure had consequences, and Becky had never taken losing quietly. Whatever she did next wouldn't be subtle, and Tom was ready. Becky's name still appeared on Tom's phone, sometimes late at night, sometimes in the early hours before dawn, as if she were hoping to catch him tired enough to answer. Missed calls. Long text messages that shifted in tone from anger to apology to accusation, often all in the same paragraph. Tom read none of them. He let them sit unopened, then deleted them in batches, a quiet ritual that grew easier each time. The silence was no longer an absence, it was a boundary. With Becky shut out, the house changed. Mornings were calmer, evenings stretched without tension. Tom focused on simple things, getting Connor to school on time, cooking meals that didn't come from a rush or a sense of obligation. They talked more now, real conversations instead of careful ones. Connor asked questions, shared opinions, sometimes disagreed, then waited, surprised, when Tom listened. Tom felt the difference in himself, too. The constant edge he'd lived with for years, the need to anticipate Becky's moods, her demands, her sudden crises was gone. Cutting her off hadn't made him colder. It had made him clearer. He could finally see how often his choices had been shaped by guilt instead of love. Connor grew into the space that silence created. He started handling things on his own homework, scheduling, even cooking simple meals when Tom was busy. His posture changed, his voice steadied. Teachers stopped mentioning concern and started mentioning potential. The boy who once seemed permanently braced for disappointment now walked like he expected to be heard. Meanwhile, Becky's world narrowed. Friends stopped returning her calls. Family gatherings went on without her. The legal case followed her everywhere, quiet but inescapable. The same people who once deferred to her now kept their distance. For the first time, there was no one left to blame but herself. The isolation she had built for Connor now surrounded her. Tom didn't celebrate that. He didn't take pleasure in her downfall. He simply acknowledged it as truth. One evening, as he and Connor sat in the living room, working on a puzzle spread across the coffee table, Tom felt something settle in his chest. Peace. Not the kind that erased loss, but the kind that coexisted with it. He had lost a daughter not in death, but in choice, and that grief was real. But so was the relief. He looked at Connor, focused and calm, no longer carrying the weight of an adult's failures. The future, once uncertain, once vulnerable to manipulation, was now protected. The family's legacy was no longer something that could be quietly drained or distorted. It was safe. Later that night, Tom stood by the window, watching the streetlights glow against the dark. His phone sat untouched on the table behind him. No buzzing, no dread, no need to check. He had done what he needed to do. For himself, for Connor. And as he turned off the light and headed down the hall, Tom knew, with a certainty that no argument or accusation could shake, that cutting Becky off hadn't broken his family. It had saved what mattered. The courtroom was smaller than Tom expected. They sat there in silence for a moment, the kind that didn't need filling. Two people who had no grand columns, no dramatic silence, just polished wood, muted colors, and the quiet tension of people waiting for a decision that would change everything. Tom sat beside his attorney, hands folded neatly in his lap, his posture calm but alert. Across the aisle, Becky sat stiffly with her own lawyer, eyes fixed forward, jaw tight. She didn't look at Tom once. The case unfolded in measured steps. Documents entered into record, financial trails laid out with precision, dates, amounts, signatures, each piece built on the last, forming a story Becky could no longer interrupt or explain away. Her attempts to challenge the will claims of misunderstanding, of family agreements made in good faith, fell flat against the evidence. When the judge spoke, his tone was firm, almost clinical. The estate would remain secured under Tom's control, with Connor named as the sole beneficiary. Becky's motions were denied. There would be no reversal, no second chance to reshape the outcome. Tom didn't react outwardly. No sigh of relief. No smile. He simply nodded once, the weight of uncertainty lifting from his shoulders. The future, Connor's future, was no longer vulnerable to appeals or manipulation. Becky's lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently. Becky's face drained of color as the reality settled in. This wasn't a setback. It was final. Outside the courtroom, the fallout spread quickly. Reporters lingered, questions sharp and relentless. Stories followed about the misused funds, the hidden transfers, the grandfather who stepped in when no one else would. Becky's name appeared in print alongside words she had spent her life avoiding. Deception, exploitation, greed. Doors closed to her quietly after that. Invitations stopped. Phone calls went unanswered. The social circle she had carefully built unraveled under the weight of public truth. The isolation she once dismissed as impossible became unavoidable. Tom didn't watch it happen closely. He didn't need to. He went home and sat at the kitchen table with Connor, spreading out college brochures and vocational pamphlets. They talked about possibilities, not demands, not expectations, just options. Connor listened, thoughtful, asking questions that reached forward instead of backward. "I want to do something that matters," Connor said. Tom smiled softly. "You will." That night, as Tom tucked the legal documents into a folder and placed them in the safe, he felt a steady sense of empowerment, not from winning, but from protecting. Becky had lost everything she tried to take for herself, not because Tom wanted revenge, but because the truth had finally been allowed to stand. He looked down the hall toward Connor's room, hearing music playing softly, a sound of ease that hadn't existed there before. Whatever anger or grief remained no longer ruled him. Tom stood firm in the quiet house, knowing that the line he'd drawn had held, and though the battle was over, the consequences for everyone were still unfolding. Tom noticed the change first in small ways, a nod from a neighbor who used to look away, a hand on his shoulder at the grocery store. People who had once treated him with polite distance now stopped to ask how he and Connor were doing. The story had spread quietly at first, then with growing clarity. Everyone seemed to know what had happened, or at least enough of it to understand why Tom had finally spoken up. Friends from years past reached out, old Navy buddies, distant cousins he hadn't spoken to in decades. They didn't ask for details, they didn't push. They simply said the same thing in different ways. "You did the right thing." The words landed heavier than Tom expected. For so long, his silence had been mistaken for weakness. Now people saw it for what it had been: patience stretched too thin. What surprised Tom most was how light he felt. For the first time in years, he wasn't managing Becky's image. He wasn't smoothing things over, explaining her behavior, pretending nothing was wrong. He moved through his days without that constant pressure, and it felt like breathing freely after years underwater. Becky, meanwhile, became the cautionary tale, whispered in corners and spoken aloud in headlines. The same community that once admired her composure now recoiled from her name. Invitations dried up. Support vanished. People didn't argue her side anymore. The evidence had spoken too clearly. Isolation wrapped around her, earned and unavoidable. Tom didn't seek out that outcome. He accepted it. With the noise fading, Tom and Connor focused on themselves. They planned. They laughed. They argued over small, ordinary things: chores, music, dinner, choices, conflicts that ended without lasting damage. Becky's in-laws disappeared entirely from their lives, their influence evaporating the moment money and control were no longer attached. At a small community gathering one evening, Tom stood near the back, content to listen. Someone raised a glass and thanked him publicly for doing what most people are too afraid to do. The applause was brief, respectful. Tom nodded once, uncomfortable but grateful. On the drive home, Connor spoke up. "People are different now." Tom glanced at him. "Different how?" "They don't look at us like we're broken," Connor said. Tom smiled softly. That mattered more than any praise. As the days settled into a new rhythm, Tom felt stronger, not hardened, but grounded. The doubt that once followed him everywhere was gone. He had faced the fallout. He had protected what mattered. And as he watched Connor step confidently into the future, Tom knew the community's support was just an echo of something deeper. He had finally chosen the right side. Tom sat alone on the back porch as evening settled in, the sky fading from pale grey to deep blue. The house behind him was quiet, not the tense silence he'd grown used to over the years, but an easy one earned, stable. He wrapped his hands around a warm mug and let himself breathe, really breathe, in a way he hadn't allowed himself to in a long time. Not that long ago, he'd felt trapped by obligation, by guilt, by the constant need to fix what his daughter broke without ever admitting it was broken. He'd told himself that endurance was strength, that keeping the peace was the same as protecting the family. Now, sitting here with the weight lifted, he understood how wrong he'd been. Taking control hadn't come from anger, it had come from clarity. His thoughts drifted, as they often did now, to Kat. He could picture her clearly sitting at the kitchen table, hands folded, eyes steady. She'd never been loud about her values, but she'd been immovable about them. Loyalty, integrity, family first, always. Tom smiled faintly, imagining what she would have said if she'd seen him now. "It's about time," she would have told him. Not unkindly, just honestly. For years, he'd been afraid that standing up would mean losing everything. Instead, it had stripped away what never truly belonged. What remained felt real, solid, earned. The door creaked softly behind him, and Connor stepped out onto the porch, pulling a hoodie tighter around himself. He didn't ask if Tom wanted company. He just sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. That simple assumption that he was welcome still caught Tom off guard sometimes. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the last of the light disappear. Tom thought about the man he'd become over the past months. Not perfect, not fearless, but present. He was the kind of father he'd wanted to be when Becky was young but hadn't known how. The kind of grandfather Connor needed now. Someone who didn't look away. Someone who stayed. His bond with Connor wasn't built on rescuing anymore. It was built on trust, on shared mornings and unhurried conversations, on the quiet understanding that they were moving forward together, not clinging to what had failed behind them. For the first time, Tom understood what his legacy really was. Not money, not property, not even the name carried on paper. It was this: showing up, drawing lines, choosing integrity even when it cost him. His daughter's actions no longer defined him. His response did. He started thinking about what came next. Maybe a small trip, just the two of them. Maybe finally fixing up the old workshop out back, teaching Connor how to use the tools Tom hadn't touched in years. College visits. Plans that didn't feel rushed or desperate, just possible. Connor shifted beside him. "You okay?" he asked. Tom nodded, smiling. "Yeah, better than okay." The porch light flicked on automatically, casting a warm glow around them. Tom looked out into the quiet night, feeling something settle deep in his chest. Not pride exactly, but peace. He had faced what needed to be faced. He had chosen what mattered. And for the first time in years, Tom Andrews knew without doubt that he was free. The envelope arrived on a quiet morning, slipped through the mail slot with a soft, almost unremarkable sound. Tom noticed it right away anyway. He always did. The return address told him everything before he even picked it up his lawyer's office. The final confirmation he'd been waiting for without letting himself hope too hard. He sat at the kitchen table for a long moment, the envelope unopened in his hands. Sunlight spilled across the wood, warm and steady. This was it. The end of a chapter that had cost him sleep, peace, and a relationship he once thought unbreakable. Tom opened the letter. The words were clean, direct, final. All appeals exhausted, all challenges denied. The court had ruled decisively Connor Andrews was the sole beneficiary, with full legal control secured through the trust Tom had established. Becky's last attempt to contest the will had failed. It was over. Tom leaned back in his chair, eyes closing as a slow breath left his chest. He hadn't realized how much tension he'd been carrying until it released all at once. This wasn't victory in the way people imagined it. There was no surge of triumph, no desire to celebrate. What he felt instead was relief deep, grounding, unmistakable. He thought back to where it had all begun. The cold porch, Connor standing outside while adults ate and laughed inside. That moment had cracked something open in him. Everything that followed the confrontations, the legal battles, the public fallout had been set in motion by that single realization. He could no longer protect the idea of family at the cost of an actual child. Now, sitting there with the letter in his hands, Tom knew he'd done exactly what needed to be done. He folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the envelope, then set it aside. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Connor came into the kitchen, backpack slung over one shoulder. "You look serious," he said. Tom smiled faintly. "Come sit." Connor did, his expression curious but calm. Tom slid the envelope across the table. "It's official," he said. "Everything's settled. It's yours, completely." Connor stared at the envelope for a second, then looked back up at Tom. "So, that's it?" "That's it," Tom said. "No more court, no more challenges." Connor nodded slowly, absorbing it. There was no excitement in his reaction, no sudden sense of entitlement, just understanding. "Thanks," he said quietly. "Not for the money. For everything else." Tom felt pride tighten his throat. "I'm proud of you," he said. "Not because of this, but because of how you handled all of it. Weathered the same storm, now standing on solid ground." The news didn't stay private for long. It never did. Within days, Tom started hearing from people he hadn't spoken to in years. Old friends, distant relatives, even a few neighbors who'd kept their distance when the story first broke. The tone was the same across the board: respect, admiration, quiet acknowledgement that standing up had cost him something, and that it had been worth it. Tom accepted the words without letting them change him. He didn't need validation anymore. He had clarity. That evening, after dinner, he and Connor took a walk through the neighborhood. The air was crisp, the kind that sharpened the senses without biting. Houses glowed softly as lights flicked on one by one. Life moving forward, indifferent to past drama. "You ever think about what comes next?" Connor asked. "All the time," Tom said. "But not in a rush." Connor nodded. "That's good." They reached the end of the block and turned back, their footsteps in easy rhythm. Tom realized then that his legacy, something he'd worried about more than he liked to admit, was no longer abstract. It wasn't bound up in money, or property, or control. It was here, walking beside him, safe, steady, free to choose his own path. Later that night, Tom stood by the window, looking out at the darkened street. His phone buzzed with a notification, a message from someone congratulating him on the outcome. He read it, then set the phone down without replying. He didn't need to say anything more. The fight was over. The future was secure. And for the first time since Kat had passed, Tom felt something settle fully into place. Not grief, not anger, not even relief alone, but peace. He had protected his grandson. He had honored his values. And as he turned off the light and headed down the hall, Tom Andrews knew without hesitation that he had made the final decision the right way. Thanksgiving came again without ceremony, without guests, without tension hanging in the air like a test no one wanted to fail. Tom woke early that morning, the house still dark, the kind of quiet that felt intentional instead of lonely. For the first time in years, the date on the calendar didn't bring a knot to his chest. It brought clarity. Connor came down the stairs a little later, hair still messy, wearing one of Tom's old sweaters without asking. That small detail would have annoyed Tom once. Now it made him smile. "Morning," Connor said. "Morning," Tom replied. "You hungry?" They cooked together, slowly. No elaborate menu, just turkey breast, potatoes, vegetables Connor actually liked. Music played low from the radio, something old, familiar, not chosen to impress anyone. They talked while they worked, about nothing urgent. School, a movie Connor wanted to see, a neighbor's dog that barked too much. It felt almost strange how normal it all was. They sat down at the table when the food was ready. No empty chairs, no careful conversations, no one performing for anyone else. Tom noticed Connor eating comfortably, unguarded, the way kids did when they weren't waiting for the mood to change. That alone made the day feel like a victory. Afterward, they took a walk through the neighborhood, hands shoved into pockets against the cold. Leaves crunched underfoot. Decorations were already going up, lights blinking on porches. Life moving forward, unconcerned with the storms they'd survived. Tom felt lighter than he had in years, like he'd finally put something down he'd been carrying too long. In the weeks that followed, Tom started returning to things he'd abandoned without realizing it. The workshop out back was the first. He cleaned it slowly, dusting off tools he hadn't touched since Kat was alive. The smell of sawdust felt familiar, grounding. Connor joined him sometimes, curious, asking questions. Tom taught him what he knew, patient, in a way he hadn't always been as a father. Connor changed too, more visibly now. He stood straighter, spoke with confidence that didn't flicker when challenged. He made plans, real ones, and followed through. Tom watched him grow, not out of necessity, but out of safety. Without constant neglect pulling at him, Connor had room to become himself. Some evenings, they sat on the couch watching old movies. Other nights, they worked side by side in silence, comfortable enough not to fill it. Tom realized he wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop anymore. He wasn't bracing for Becky's calls, her moods, her crises. That chapter had closed, and the quiet that followed wasn't emptiness, it was peace. He reflected often on what the past year had taught him. That love without boundaries wasn't love at all, that protecting family sometimes meant standing against it, that he was allowed to choose integrity over guilt, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. One afternoon, Connor looked up from a college brochure spread across the table. "You ever regret it?" he asked, not accusing, just curious. Tom thought for a moment. "I regret not acting sooner," he said honestly. "I don't regret acting." Connor nodded, satisfied with that. As evening fell on Thanksgiving Day, they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching the sky darken. No speeches, no dramatic closure, just two people sharing warmth, aware of how hard won it was. Tom realized then that this was what winning actually looked like. Not applause, not revenge, just freedom. Freedom to live honestly, to care without fear, to build something steady after so much instability. When they went inside and turned off the lights, Tom paused in the hallway, listening to Connor move around in his room, humming quietly. The sound settled something deep in him. This wasn't the life he'd imagined years ago. It was better. And as Tom headed to bed, feeling content and unburdened, he knew the past no longer had a claim on them. Whatever came next would be faced together, calm, grounded, and finally free. The changes didn't happen all at once. They unfolded quietly, the way real life always did, in moments that only made sense when Tom looked back at them together. Connor began to treat the house like it was truly his, not a place he might be asked to leave at any moment. He left his shoes by the door without apologizing for the mess. He played music while he studied. He spoke up when he disagreed. Each small act carried an unspoken truth he felt safe. Tom noticed how their conversations shifted too. They weren't just about rules or responsibilities anymore. They talked about ideas, about choices, about mistakes Tom had made and lessons he'd learned too late. Connor listened, not with resentment, but with curiosity. And when he spoke, Tom listened the same way. Respect had replaced authority. Trust had replaced fear. Invitations started arriving in unexpected ways. A handwritten note from a neighbor inviting Tom to a backyard cookout. A phone call from an old Navy friend he hadn't heard from since retirement. Even a casual mention at the hardware store, "We're glad you're around again." People who had once kept their distance now made space for him, not out of pity, but admiration. Tom understood it. Courage had a way of clarifying things. When he'd stayed silent, people hadn't known where to place him. Now they did. Connor's world expanded too. He joined a school club, took on a part-time job, talked about plans with a confidence that no longer wavered when challenged. Tom watched him navigate setbacks without folding in on himself, and each time, pride rose in his chest, quiet, steady, earned. One evening, Tom stood in the doorway as Connor worked at his desk, focused, headphones on, completely absorbed. Tom didn't interrupt. He just watched, his heart full in a way that surprised him. All the fights, all the doubt, all the nights he'd questioned whether he was doing the right thing they had led here. Stability wasn't loud. Peace didn't announce itself. It simply existed. Tom started showing up more too. Community meetings, volunteer events, local fundraisers. He didn't speak much at first, content to listen, but when he did, people listened back. His voice carried weight now, not because he demanded it, but because he'd proven he meant what he said. He found himself helping a neighbor fix a fence one weekend, advising a younger man through a tough family decision another. Tom didn't give speeches. He just told the truth as he knew it. Protect what matters, even when it costs you. The community responded to that honesty. Slowly, naturally, Tom became part of things again. Not as someone to lean on out of convenience, but as someone respected for his principles. There were moments, quiet ones, when grief still surfaced. When he thought of Becky not as she was now, but as the child she'd once been. Those moments didn't break him anymore. He let them pass, understanding that love and accountability could exist in the same space, even when reconciliation couldn't. Connor noticed Tom's calm. "You're different," he said one night, not accusing, just observing. Tom smiled. "I feel different." Stronger didn't mean harder. It meant clearer. It meant standing upright without tension pulling at his shoulders. It meant knowing, deep down, that he could face whatever came next without losing himself in the process. As weeks turned into months, Tom realized something simple and profound. The legacy he was building wasn't about what he left behind, it was about what he was living now. Strength modeled, not preached. Integrity practiced, not claimed. One evening, as the sun dipped low and Connor laughed at something on his phone, Tom felt it fully. Everything he had fought for, every painful decision, every line drawn had brought them here. He smiled, not out of triumph, but out of certainty. This life, this peace, this future, they weren't borrowed. They were earned. Time softened the sharp edges without dulling the truth. Days settled into weeks, weeks into months. And Tom found that peace wasn't something that arrived all at once, it grew quietly, reinforced by routine. Mornings had a rhythm now. Coffee on the stove. Connor heading out the door with a quick goodbye that didn't sound rushed or wary. Evenings filled with simple plans instead of emotional landmines. The chaos that once hovered over every interaction was gone, replaced by something steadier. Connor carried himself differently. Tom noticed it in the way he spoke to adults, in how he handled disappointment without shutting down. The boy no longer moved through life braced for rejection. He made decision, took responsibility, failed occasionally, then tried again. Tom watched all of it with a quiet sense of fulfillment that surprised him. This growth, was the proof he hadn't known he needed. One Saturday afternoon, Tom attended a community gathering at the local hall. He almost didn't go. Old habits told him to stay home, to avoid attention. But Connor had nudged him out the door with an easy, "You should go." When Tom walked in, Conversations paused, not awkwardly, but with recognition. People smiled. Hands reached out. Neighbors who once passed him without a glance greeted him by name. A few thanked him outright, their words simple but sincere. "Takes guts to do what you did." Tom nodded, uncomfortable with praise but no longer suspicious of it. Respect felt different when it wasn't demanded or earned through silence, but through action. As he stood there, listening more than he spoke, Tom reflected on the path that had brought him here. He hadn't set out to inspire anyone. He had only wanted to protect his grandson. Yet somehow, by refusing to look away, he had shown others that boundaries weren't cruelty, and that accountability didn't erase love, it clarified it. Across town, Becky lived a very different reality. The noise around her had faded, leaving a silence she couldn't escape. Without Tom to blame, without Connor to control, she faced the consequences she had avoided for years. Friends kept their distance. Calls went unanswered. The version of herself she had carefully curated no longer held. Tom heard pieces of it through others, never directly, and never in detail. He didn't ask questions. There was no bitterness left in him, no satisfaction either, just acceptance. Tom understood now that carrying anger would only tether him to the past he'd already survived. He chose instead to stay focused on the path ahead, the life he and Connor were building one decision at a time. College plans, summer work, fixing up the house, conversations that stretched late into the night, not because they were heavy, but because they mattered. One evening, after dinner, Tom sat on the porch while Connor worked on a project nearby, music playing softly. The air was calm, familiar. Tom felt the absence of the old emotional weight, the constant vigilance, the guilt, the fear of confrontation. It was gone, not replaced by emptiness, but by space. Space to think, to feel, to live honestly. He realized then that this was the turning point, not the court ruling, not the confrontation, not even the moment he drew the line. This quiet clarity was the real shift, the understanding that he no longer owed explanations to anyone who had benefited from his silence. Tom watched Connor laugh at something on his screen, unguarded and present. The sound carried easily through the evening, unshadowed by tension. Tom smiled to himself, aware that freedom wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady. And as the light faded and the day came to a close, Tom knew this chapter wasn't ending, it was opening. Whatever lay ahead would be faced without fear, without chains to the past. For the first time, he wasn't just surviving the aftermath, he was choosing what came next. The days no longer felt like something to endure. They unfolded naturally, one into the next, steady and unforced. Tom and Connor spent more time together now, not because they were clinging to each other after everything they'd been through, but because they genuinely enjoyed the rhythm they'd built. Mornings started with shared routines. Evenings ended with conversations that wandered without needing a destination. There was laughter, quiet, easy laughter, and a sense of stability that neither of them felt the need to question. One afternoon, Tom suggested they visit the cemetery. Connor didn't hesitate. He just nodded. The drive was calm, the kind where words weren't required. When they arrived, the air was cool and still. Kat's headstone sat exactly where it always had, clean and simple, framed by trees that had grown taller over the years. Tom stood there for a long moment, hands in his coat pockets, letting memory settle without pushing it away. He knelt and brushed away a few fallen leaves. "I think you'd be proud," he said quietly, not embarrassed by the words. "I finally learned what you were trying to teach me." There was no rush of grief this time, no ache that demanded something from him, just closure, pride. He had stood up. He had protected what mattered. He had chosen integrity when it would have been easier to stay silent. Tom felt it clearly. Kat would have stood right beside him through all of it. Connor waited a respectful distance away. When Tom stood, they shared a look that needed no explanation. Not long after, they took a short trip together, nothing extravagant. Just a few days away, somewhere quiet, somewhere untouched by old arguments and family tension. Tom realized, as they crossed the city limits, how long it had been since he'd felt this light while traveling. No dread, no anticipation of a call that might ruin everything. Becky's shadow no longer followed them. The trip was filled with small moments that stayed with Tom more than any landmark ever could. Coffee early in the morning, long walks without conversation, Connor pointing things out simply because he could. At night, Tom lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar quiet of a place that held no history for them, and found comfort in that. He reflected on how far he'd come. The pain of the past hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined him. It had shaped him, sharpened his understanding of what mattered. He was a man who valued family not as an idea, but as an action. A man who understood that strength wasn't control, it was clarity. On the last evening of the trip, Connor looked out over the view and said, "I like this. Us." Tom nodded. "Me too." For a moment, Tom thought about the family he'd once hoped to preserve at any cost. Then he looked at the one standing beside him now. This one was real, built on trust instead of obligation, respect instead of fear. When they returned home, nothing felt heavy. Tom looked forward to ordinary days, to future plans, to whatever challenges might come next, not with anxiety, but with readiness. Regret no longer had a place to land. Guilt no longer dictated his choices. The family Tom had hoped for hadn't arrived the way he once imagined. It arrived better. And as he watched Connor unlock the front door, confident and unburdened, Tom felt certain of one thing. This peace wasn't temporary. It was earned. The house was quiet in the way it only ever got during the first snowfall of the year. Snow drifted past the windows in slow, deliberate patterns, softening the edges of the world outside. Tom sat on the couch with a blanket pulled over his legs, a mug cooling in his hands. Connor sat nearby, feet tucked under himself, flipping through photos on his phone, pictures from the trip they'd taken, from ordinary days that now felt anything but ordinary. "You ever think about how different things could have gone?" Connor asked, not looking up. Tom considered the question carefully. "All the time," he said, "but I don't dwell on it anymore." Connor nodded, like he understood exactly what that meant. They sat together for a while, letting the quiet do the talking. Tom's eyes drifted to the window, watching the snow accumulate on the porch railing, on the steps where so much had begun. He remembered that first Thanksgiving clearly, the cold, the anger, the disbelief, the moment he'd realized that standing still was no longer an option. The hardest part hadn't been the confrontation. It hadn't been the courtrooms or the headlines or even the loss of his daughter. The hardest part had been